So today on our podcast, we continue our story about the person who many believe was Walt Disney's favorite artist. Mary Blair would have two periods of deep connection with the Disney company, both for animation and then later for the parks. We are now moving into and then through that first period, where her work would help define many Disney films. In our last episode, we looked at the last big stretch of work for both Mary and her husband Lee during World War II. And today we'll explore how Mary's life was remade after the war. So, if you're ready, let's go. By the start of summer 1945, most Americans understood that the war with Japan was coming to an end. On August 6, the U.S. Army Air Force detonated an atomic bomb over Hiroshima. 3 days later, another over Nagasaki. Within days, Japan announced its surrender, and on September 2nd, terms were formalized when Japanese officials signed an instrument of surrender on the USS Missouri stationed in Tokyo Bay. For Mary, the end of the war meant that Lee would soon be discharged from the Navy, though the process would take months. During this time, Lee considered his career options. He was deciding between studio work in California or starting his own firm to make industrial documentaries and training films much like he had made for the Navy. He sent a letter to Walt asking about his job possibilities. He also discussed opening his own business with one or two fellow officers. He was pretty sure he would take one of these two paths, though he didn't yet know which. Out in California, Mary's career continued to expand beyond the studio. Exhibitions and sale of her own art were mostly tied to Disney films. In this, part of Disney's success was tied to Mary, and part of Mary's personal success was tied to the studio. In October, Walt Disney asked Mary to paint 2 murals for Hollywood star Carmen Miranda. Miranda wanted complimentary paintings on 2 living room walls in her Beverly Hills home, images based on the Bahia section of the Three Caballeros, a section where her sister Aurora Miranda danced with Donald Duck through the streets of Brazil. Mary's paintings included only human dancers and musicians moving down the whimsically patterned streets. In this, she was given the opportunity to work on canvases far larger than those she arranged for the studio, both paintings being roughly 3 feet wide. When they were finished, Miranda displayed them in recessed alcoves, one painting on either side of her leopard print sofa. During these same weeks, again under the auspices of the studio, Mary prepared her concept watercolors and sketches to be exhibited in the Arizona State Museum. Again, these were from her trips to Latin America. The atmosphere sketches, the museum announced, were made by Mary Blair, one of the Disney story artists who toured South America in 1941 with Disney. Most of the watercolors are of South America, but one of Mexico was painted as research material for the Three Caballeros. The exhibit opened the first week of November. Critics praised her inventive use of color to capture regional culture. One of the charming images, critic Dorothy Page said, is an Andean village scene in Peru, in which each home displays a little red flag. According to the custom, the flag indicated that chica, the native drink, had been prepared and is ready to be served. With this Disney Blair exhibition, Mary was again the artistic face of the studio, an ambassador who bridged the worlds of fine and commercial art in a way that intrigued the public. The new out-of-state show was also a sign that Mary's work in terms of public recognition had now risen above that of Lee. Throughout the fall, Lee continued to discuss his job options with Walt. Walt wanted him to join Retta Scott and Jim Bertrero in developing an animated short about the history of the Grand Canyon, specifically the film as it was then envisioned, would explore the culture and mythology of the Hopi people and their historical connection with the canyon. It was planned for the package feature focused on American mythology, a short arranged around an orchestral composition called the Grand Canyon Suite. Related segments then being developed included the folk legends of Johnny Appleseed, Paul Bunyan, and Pecos Bill. At the end of the war, Lee explained, Disney wanted me to come back and do another musical sequence for Grand Canyon Suite. But by this point, Lee wasn't convinced that the studio represented his best opportunity, especially now that he was a producer. It was a step down, back into the role he had had over 3 years ago. In a letter sent to Mary on October 30th, Lee discussed his discharge timeline and career possibilities. The new point setup will allow me to be eligible for discharge on December 1st with 44.5 points, he explained. But if I come out to California for a few weeks, I'll be out the plane or train fare and so on. But it would be nice to spend Christmas at home. However, at that time, I'm really going to be steamed up on this business of starting on my own. It's still a question about possibly starting a new studio, but I shall settle it in a few days. He then explained that with the war over, he was able to take leave time and finally focus on his own watercolors. We had a wonderful time in Woodstock, New York, and the drive up and back reminded me very much of old trips to San Francisco and San Jose. I painted a watercolor of the house where Eugene Spicer lives. The Navy would request that Lee stay longer than December 1st to finish a project then in production. It would also take Lee more than a few days to settle his post-war plans, during which he continued to swap letters with Walt. As in letters to other upper-level artists who had left for the service, Walt presented to Lee a vision in which the studio would return to the type of features they had made before the war. Walt was eager to rehire artists who had left for military service, as this was the quickest way to rebuild, with people deeply familiar with Disney animation. Walt knew that he was far more persuasive in person than in writing, so on December 4th, Walt wrote Lee, with your past experience here and your present experience gained in the Navy, plus your talents, I know you are bound to fit very well into our organization. If you could get a short leave of absence to come out and discuss the situation generally with various people here in the studio, this might be a better way of determining what you want to do. Walt closed his letter by saying, with all my best, then signed his name. What was missing from Walt's letter was the admission that for the time being, the studio still didn't have permission from the Bank of America to return to traditional animated features. All of the projects then moving forward were either package features that arranged multiple short subjects under a single theme like the Three Caballeros, or mixed genre features such as Song of the South and So Dear to My Heart that blended sections of animation with sections of live action. In terms of total running time, Song of the South contained only 25% animation, So Dear to My Heart contained only 10%. No animated features with a single story, similar to Snow White or Pinocchio, were then moving forward. But through Mary, Lee likely had a good idea as to what projects were advancing through the studio. In the days that followed, Lee convinced himself that it would be better to start his own production company on the East Coast, a small unit to make training films and documentaries for industry. Moreover, he wanted to establish this company in New York. Already he could see that if television took off in a few years, New York would be the center of TV production, while film production remained in Los Angeles. If TV did become popular, various entities such as advertising firms, large companies, and even the networks themselves would need commercials, title sequences, public service announcements, paid content, and so on. Mentally, Lee came up with a list of reasons as to why it would be a mistake to return to California. Among them were, at the Disney studio, competition was fantastic. People were stepping all over each other. And Walt wanted me to come back and work on the Grand Canyon suite, but with him you were only good as your last scene. And lastly, he now could see that Walt wanted him to take on the exact same role without much of a promotion as he had had before the war. There was, however, one other reason that almost surely looped quietly through his mind, even if he never talked about it or explored it with language. For as long as he had known Mary, he had been the trailblazer. He had been the first with the California scene movement, first at iWork Studio, first at Harmonizing, first at Disney, first even on that 1941 South American trip. But now Mary was in a class by herself. She was no longer one of the Disney concept artists. She was the concept artist. If Lee returned, he would be in her shadow, which almost surely would be a challenge for him. In short, if he returned to the studio, he might be known as the other Blair, the person whose work was not quite as central to Disney production as that of Mary. With others, Lee discussed the financial advantages of starting his own firm, also how a production company would use those skills he had developed in the Navy. Moreover, he would be eligible for low-interest loans that were being offered to GIs to start their own businesses. After considering his options and after talking with Mary, Lee decided to start a small company in New York whenever he was able to leave the service. Well, I had acclimated myself to the East Coast, he said, and didn't want to go back after the war. But then two unexpected events happened. First, Walt told Mary that she could continue to work for the studio, even if she was living in New York. Over the past 3 years, she had worked remotely on Disney projects, while in Mexico, Cuba, Georgia, Virginia, Maryland, New York, and Indiana. This arrangement would simply formalize how she had previously worked. Now, instead of leaving the studio for weeks at a time, she would work in New York and then return to the studio every few months to participate in meetings and discuss projects with other Disney artists. This arrangement, too, spoke to how deeply Walt valued Mary's work. She was the only Disney artist who permanently worked from home and occasionally commuted to the studio. Second, as a gesture of goodwill, almost surely more to Mary than to Lee, Walt asked Lee if his new production company could take on an unfinished documentary Disney had been making for General Motors. During the war, Disney had taken on projects for industry, including multiple films for General Motors. They were about to deliver one called The ABC of Hand Tools, but GM wanted titles beyond this. With the war over, Walt focused his limited resources on theatrical offerings. The next film in the GM series was called The ABC of the Automotive Engine, which through live action and limited animation would explain how a gasoline engine worked. Disney had already done preliminary work, which, if Lee was interested, Walt would also pass along to him. The project came with an implicit promise that if Lee did a good job on this, General Motors was interested in more explanatory films in the ABC series. The studio called me up while I was still in the Navy, Lee explained, and they said, "Think you could lay this thing out and produce a film that started out as a Disney film?" "Sure, why not?" he said. "I used to work down there." With this, even before he had rented office space, Lee, along with 2 friends and co-investors, now had their first project. As for Mary, she would need to pack up their house in Los Angeles and prepare for the move. For years, she had lived in Los Angeles, making a family out of her friends while visiting Lee on the East Coast. Now she would live with Lee on the East Coast while regularly visiting her friends and the studio in Los Angeles. Her life would still have two unique halves. Only the place where she made her primary home would shift from California to New York. On February 13, 1946, Lee officially separated from the military with the rank of lieutenant commander. A few weeks later, he began his own production company, Film Graphics, based on New York's Long Island. In retrospect, the move to New York was the key decision that led to later troubles, the shifting away from his and Mary's longtime homes in California, their friends in studio animation, and their connections within the arts community to start a new life out east, where Lee was now the co-founder of a small company. His business was located in the Corona section of Queens, New York, not far from Flushing Meadows, which had been the location of the 1939 New York World's Fair. Lee also bought a small house not far from Northern Boulevard, near the center of town. There was no sense coming back to California, Lee explained. TV was just starting in New York, and the rents were a lot less back there. With Lee as president, he formed Film Graphics with Leon Levy and Bernie Rubin, with whom he had created training material for the Navy. Their office was, fittingly, in a location previously used by a draft board and one floor above a movie theater. It was a large open space. Half the floor was arranged for hand-drawn animation, the other half for stop motion, both of which could be used for commercial and industrial projects. The business opened either in March or April 1946. Their first project for General Motors, a gift from Walt, came complete with storyboards and character designs. Disney artists had roughed out figures to represent air, fuel, and ignition. Well, air was a big bubble, Lee explained. Fuel was a little drop, and ignition was a spark. When Lee and his small staff finished this project, General Motors gave them more work to continue their ABC series. Later films included the ABC of the diesel engine and the ABC of jet propulsion. More importantly, Lee used that first ABC film as a demo to show potential clients what his company could produce. He worked with local businesses and national corporations. During slow periods, he asked the Navy if they needed any documentary or training films, which they often did. At one point, Lee's company made a picture about tuberculosis for the military. For some of his efforts, he assigned the animation to his brother Preston, who had moved to Connecticut a year or two after Lee opened shop. But Lee's real goal here was to position his company for TV spots and commercials, which he believed would soon develop into a significant market. Lee was also having a house built, not a large one, but something that would be comfortable for himself and Mary, along with a cat or two. As for Mary, once she was in Queens, her professional life with Disney advanced almost the same as it had in California. Most of her projects were still moving forward. Shooting was about to start on So Dear to My Heart in California's San Joaquin Valley. Once Upon a Wintertime was being finalized for a future package feature, and Song of the South was on track to be released at the end of the year. Beside the live-action version of Alice in Wonderland, the other picture on which Mary had worked that was now in trouble was Carnival, the project for which she had traveled to Cuba. By the early months of 1946, Carnival had a new working title, Latin Rhapsody. The underlying problem was that the U.S. government no longer funded Goodwill Pictures now that the war was over. Despite this, work continued on the feature, or at least some sections of it, including a cartoon segment largely designed by Mary called Fiesta of the Flowers. In this cartoon, all of the characters were anthropomorphic flowers, The musical story was straightforward. A manly flower with a wide sombrero and cape rides into town on a leafy horse. Beneath moon-dappled fronds, he dances with a lady flower dressed in a flowing gown, until at the end their courtship was secure. As Carnival or Latin Rhapsody was slowly abandoned, the studio considered moving this short to another package feature loosely themed around music. But eventually, this cartoon was never developed with animation. Mary's work creating flower-based characters with visual personalities, however, would help her on a later project a few years down the road. By this point, Mary's work for Disney had taken her to Georgia, Indiana, New York, Cuba, Brazil, Argentina, Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico. Walt had considered sending her to Ireland to work on the Little People project, but that story wasn't ready to be visually developed. Now in 1946, Walt considered her for another international project, this one focused on the culture of France. After the war, Disney and its distributor RKO found that they had funds impounded in various European countries. The largest sum was in England, where Disney and RKO would eventually film Treasure Island, but Disney had funds restricted to other countries, including France. Typically, governments required that foreign companies, such as Walt Disney Productions, spend impounded funds locally to develop their post-war economy. One plan to spend down the funds that were in France was partially developed by Mary's friend and member of that first trip to Latin America, Jack Cutting. Ideas came to him while he was in Europe developing distribution deals in recently reopened markets for Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Bambi. He traveled through war-ravaged cities to book Disney pictures recently dubbed into German, Dutch, Italian, and French. He was also developing a plan whereby Disney might spend down impounded funds. Already, Disney had explored solutions to the problems of impounded funds. They had moved some Disney workers to foreign cities such as Paris, as block funds could be paid to employees, even Americans working in those cities. They had considered making foreign documentaries as part of their People and Places series that featured some European cultures, but another strategy was to create packaged animated features focused on European locales, particularly that of France. A film in the mode of Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros, presenting the culture of France through animation and music. While walking the streets of Paris, Cutting became convinced that this city was layered with engaging stories, a place where Disney artists could find narrative inspirations much like they had on that first trip to Latin America. Cutting suggested that Walt send a few artists over to France, starting with Mary Blair, to sketch out ideas that could be developed into a series of short animated stories, which was an idea that for a while interested Walt. Ideally, Blair and other artists would visit during the spring of 1947, once the major cities had better recovered from the war. Presently, the rail system was only half operational. Travel by car was difficult as the country was rebuilding damaged roads, and high-quality food largely needed to be bought on the black market. Still, Cutting saw France as a promising subject for an animated musical package. In March 1946, he sent a letter to Walt that outlined how research might work. The general situation here leads me to believe that it would be better to postpone Mary Blair's trip to France until next spring. By that time, it should be quite easy to bring a small group over. I think a lot more could be accomplished that way. Right now, traveling, especially outside of Paris, is not easy. He then explained how a trip might work. If you still plan to have Mary spend a couple of weeks in Paris, making sketches, and then do the same at a few villages nearby, arrangement can be made for her. Cutting explained that one of his friends in Paris had a wife who might be an English-speaking tour guide, taking Mary to those nearby villages. If you decide to have her come over this spring, she can fly direct to Paris via TWA, Cutting concluded. My secretary knows all the particulars about getting a French visa and so on. In a separate letter to Chuck Wolcott, who had been a musical director on both Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros, Cutting sent a list of French composers and song titles that might be suitable for the musical package feature focused on French culture. After discussing one composer in the letter, Cutting told Wolcott, be sure to play this song for Walt. In the end, Walt would not pursue this project, as Disney found other ways to more easily remove impounded funds from France. This exchange, however, illustrates how deeply Mary Blair was now centered in studio culture. For a new picture requiring research, there was no question as to which artist might begin this project. For Cutting and Walt both, it was simply a foregone conclusion that Mary would fill this role. Even though Mary wasn't sent to France, she worked on many projects in 1946 and early 1947. One of the most interesting was a two-reel animated short based on the life of Johnny Appleseed, a devout man with an eccentric appearance who focused his adult life on planting apple trees across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana in the early 1800s. This project, like the short on the Grand Canyon, was intended for a package feature on American folk legends, but at the insistence of Walt, the art direction for this picture would have a unique goal. Though Once Upon a Winter Time was bringing the style of Mary Blair to the screen, those at the studio acknowledged that the film's presentation was actually a combination of Mary Blair's work, especially with character design, and the work of Currier and Ives, especially with background imagery. The short, though featuring the work of Mary, had asked her to impose her visual sensibilities into the iconic worldview of Currier and Ives. Walt now proposed another cartoon, in which Mary would define the visual style from the start, allowing her vision to establish the entire look of the cartoon without any required reference to other artists, unless she chose to include them. Whereas the 8-minute Once Upon a Wintertime was a musical offering whose entertainment value was focused on decorative art, the 18-minute Johnny Appleseed would tell the story of Johnny's life, which meant that the narrative and character presentations would be more important than in the more whimsical Wintertime. Director Wilfred Jackson understood that one of Walt's main goals here was to translate Mary's visual style onto the big screen. I saw to it that the feeling of Mary's sketches was faithfully incorporated into the picture, he explained. This then was communicated to all who worked on the picture. Story artist Ken Anderson explained, the whole thing was supposed to look like a Mary Blair thing come to life. Likewise, animator Ollie Johnston said, on Johnny Appleseed, Walt told us that he wanted to get Mary Blair's stuff on the screen. This then became the primary goal, around which various studio divisions, from layout to background to animation, worked. But the artist, more so than Walt, understood the underlying challenges. When looking over the storyboards, animator Frank Thomas told Jackson, I don't know how you can animate this. Keep that design and tell the story? Likewise, animator Ollie Johnston commented, Mary's stuff is very flat and her characters were only drawn in a way that makes them look good when in 2 dimensions. Similarly, Ken Anderson added, what works for a still drawing in one decorative position doesn't necessarily work well in movement, but still they work together to bring Mary's vision as directly as possible to the screen because, as Frank Thomas put it, Mary's drawings for Johnny Appleseed were some of the greatest things I'd ever seen. Just handsome, handsome drawings. The colors and the shapes and the way they all went together. The finished film, which would eventually be included in the package feature Melody Time, would showcase Mary's work more deeply than in Once Upon a Wintertime, especially with the color selections and backgrounds. This cartoon again would replace Disney House style with Mary's style, a testament to how much Walt liked her work and how deeply her vision shaped studio output in the late 1940s. Despite the effort of many animators and background painters, the legend of Johnny Appleseed, beautiful as it was, held the limitations that Disney artists had previously discussed. Namely, Mary's work would be difficult to animate with depth and fluidity. Many scenes in Johnny Appleseed were gorgeous, but some highlighted the lack of depth central to Mary's work. In one scene, Apples lying on the ground behind Johnny appeared to be floating behind his shoulder because the presentation didn't use the tools of 1- and 2-point perspective. Likewise, in some close-ups, the background appeared as though Johnny were standing before rising hills of apple trees, even though the grove was on flat ground. It's likely that very few general viewers noticed these issues, but Walt did. As director Wilfred Jackson recalled, "I received a devastating scolding from Walt for stressing the styling of the picture to a point where it inhibited the effectiveness of the animation, even though these elements, in effect, were the exact directions that Walt had given for the film." With Johnny Appleseed, Walt finally understood that it would be difficult to both honor Mary's flat style and present it with traditional hand-drawn animation. Despite this, Walt remained committed to Mary's work and found it valuable in arranging his narrative ideas into visual form. He also adored her sense of color, which was easy to adapt into animation. In the years ahead, he would look for other ways to present Mary's style directly to the public, though it would be a while before he came across the exact right opportunities. The big news in Mary's life, as she finished her work on Johnny Appleseed, however, didn't involve the studio. After years of trying to start a family, Mary was pregnant and by fall was far enough along to tell other people. She was now planning to have her first child early in 1947. This was one of the events that Mary had been looking forward to for years. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan, at least right now, is to look at the 2 new stage shows that are premiering at Disney World later this week, and also take a look at the 2 stage shows that have just premiered over at Epic Universe, to see generally how Disney and Universal are facing off this summer in Florida. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.